Hermann Göring stood before Adolf Hitler in mid-July 1940 with the kind of swagger only unbroken victory can produce. The Reichsmarschall had just witnessed his Luftwaffe tear through Poland in weeks, watched it shatter French resistance, and seen British forces scramble back across the Channel at Dunkirk. Now, with characteristic bombast, he made a promise that would haunt German military planning for generations. Give him 3 days, just 72 hours, and he would destroy RAF Fighter Command completely. Britain's aerial defense would cease to exist, clearing the skies for Operation Sealion, the amphibious invasion that would force Churchill's defiant island nation to its knees. Hitler wanted to believe it. Everything in his experience suggested Göring might actually deliver. The Luftwaffe had proved itself the most devastating air force in history. During the Battle of France, German aircraft had achieved air superiority so quickly that rare ground forces advanced with barely a glimpse of enemy fighters overhead. The numbers seemed to support Göring's confidence. The Luftwaffe possessed roughly 2,600 operational aircraft ready for deployment against Britain, whilst intelligence estimates suggested Fighter Command could muster perhaps 600 fighters at most. The mathematics appeared simple, even generous. Göring wasn't promising total annihilation in 3 days. He was simply claiming he could reduce Fighter Command to operational irrelevance. What made Göring's promise particularly credible was the Luftwaffe's recent performance against the RAF itself. During the fighting in France, German fighters had consistently outmaneuvered British aircraft. The Messerschmitt Bf 1009 had earned a fearsome reputation, and Luftwaffe pilots returned with tales of easy victories against outdated British tactics. Göring's intelligence officers painted a reassuring picture. Fighter Command was led by aging officers using obsolete strategies. Their pilots were undertrained, and their aircraft production couldn't possibly replace combat losses quickly enough to matter. The plan seemed straightforward enough. Luftwaffe bombers escorted by swarms of fighters would hammer RAF airfields across southern England. They would crater runways, destroy hangars, obliterate radar stations, and catch British fighters on the ground before they could scramble. Any Spitfires or Hurricanes that did manage to get airborne would face overwhelming numbers of mess and be systematically eliminated. Within those 3 days, Göring assured Hitler, Fighter Command would be so thoroughly mauled that continuing resistance would be impossible. The Luftwaffe would then turn its attention to supporting invasion barges crossing the Channel unchallenged by British fighters. Operation Sealion depended entirely on this promise. The German Navy had already expressed serious reservations about attempting an amphibious assault, whilst the Royal Navy remained intact. But Hitler's admirals agreed that with complete air superiority, even British warships could be driven from the Channel. Everything hinged on Göring delivering what he promised. The invasion barges were already being assembled in French and Belgian ports. Wehrmacht divisions waited for the order to embark. The entire momentum of German conquest, which had seemed unstoppable since September 1939, now focused on a single objective, eliminating Fighter Command in 3 days. Göring had no reason to doubt success. His Luftwaffe had never failed him. Every target assigned, every objective given, had been achieved with brutal efficiency. Why should a handful of British fighters prove any different? Standing before Hitler that July afternoon, Göring couldn't possibly know he was making the most catastrophic miscalculation in aviation history. A promise that would stretch not to 3 days, but to 4 grinding months, costing Germany 1,977 aircraft and transforming what should have been a quick victory into the Reich's first genuine defeat. What Göring's intelligence officers had completely missed was that Fighter Command wasn't the disorganized rabble they imagined. Whilst the Luftwaffe prepared its 3-day annihilation plan, Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding had spent the previous 4 years building something the Germans couldn't even conceptualize, an integrated air defense system that operated more like a single organism than a collection of separate squadrons. The Luftwaffe was about to attack what they thought was a conventional air force and instead discover they were fighting something entirely new. Dowding was a peculiar choice for such a revolutionary role, nicknamed Stuffy by his pilots. He was a taciturn, methodical officer who seemed more comfortable with technical specifications than inspiring speeches. But this very temperament made him perfect for the task. Whilst other RAF commanders focused on building bomber fleets for offensive operations, Dowding obsessed over a single question. How do you defend an entire nation from aerial attack when you're outnumbered? His answer was to stop thinking about individual aircraft and start thinking about information. The backbone of his system was radar, or RDF as the British called it then, radio direction finding. By 1940, Dowding had overseen the construction of a chain of 51 radar stations stretching along Britain's coast from Scotland to Portsmouth. These stations could detect incoming aircraft at ranges up to 120 meters, giving Fighter Command roughly 20 minutes warning before raiders reached their targets. The Germans knew Britain had radar. They'd spotted the distinctive metal towers, but they fundamentally misunderstood its purpose. Luftwaffe RAF intelligence assumed these stations simply detected approaching formations. They had no idea the British had worked out how to vector fighters directly onto incoming raids whilst the enemy was still over water. Behind the radar chain sat the Observer Corps, 30,000 volunteers equipped with binoculars, plotting tables, and telephone connections. Once raiders crossed the coast and dropped below radar coverage, these observers tracked them visually, telephoning reports to filter rooms where WAFs, Women's Auxiliary Air Force personnel, plotted aircraft positions on enormous maps using Kruger rakes to move markers across gritted tables. Every 20 seconds, these plots updated, creating a continuously refreshed picture of every aircraft movement over Britain. All this information fed into Dowding's 7-sector control rooms, which commanded individual fighter squadrons. A controller watching the plotting table could see exactly where enemy formations were heading, how many aircraft they contained, their altitude and their speed. He could then scramble the precise number of squadrons needed to intercept them, directing pilots by radio telephone to the exact position where they'd meet the raiders. Instead of wastefully mounting standing patrols or scattering fighters randomly across the sky, hoping to spot the enemy, Fighter Command could position itself with surgical precision. The Germans had nothing comparable. Luftwaffe fighters operated under loose directives from ground control, but lacked the continuous tracking and vectoring system that allowed British controllers to guide their pilots turn by turn onto targets. German formations often wandered over England, searching visually for RAF airfields, whilst Fighter Command watched their every movement on plotting tables and positioned squadrons to attack at maximum advantage. It was the difference between a blind boxer swinging at empty air and a sniper with perfect intelligence. More critically, Dowding's system meant he didn't need numerical superiority. He could concentrate force at decisive points whilst keeping reserves safely on the ground. The Luftwaffe would discover this on their very first major attack, when what should have been an overwhelming assault met coordinated resistance that seemed to materialize from nowhere. That first major attack came on the 13th of August 1940, Adlertag, Eagle Day, the date Göring had chosen to begin his 3-day destruction of Fighter Command. The morning dawned with poor weather, but the Reichsmarschall wouldn't countenance delay. At 6, the first waves began taking off from airfields across occupied France, Belgium, Holland, and Norway. By day end, the Luftwaffe would fly 1,485 sorties, the largest single-day aerial assault in history to that point. Göring watched from his headquarters, confident he'd be reporting Fighter Command's annihilation to Hitler within 72 hours. The operation began disastrously before a single bomb fell. Morning fog delayed coordination between bomber and fighter units. And when some Dornier D-17 bombers received late cancellation orders, their fighter escorts didn't get the message. 74 Messerschmitt Bf-110s flew their mission-protecting bombers that never arrived, wasting fuel and exposing themselves to RAF fighters for no purpose whatsoever. It was an embarrassing communications failure, but Göring's staff dismissed it as inconsequential. The afternoon waves would deliver the knockout blow, except Fighter Command wasn't where German intelligence said it would be. Luftwaffe targeting had focused obsessively on airfields in Kent and Sussex. Convinced these forward bases housed the bulk of British fighter strength. They'd identified Manston, Howinga, and Lympne as critical targets requiring immediate destruction. What German intelligence somehow failed to grasp was that these were forward operating bases, small airstrips where fighters refueled and rearmed between sorties. The actual sector stations controlling RAF operations, with their operations rooms, communications centres, and plotting tables, sat further inland at places like Biggin Hill, Kenley, and Hornchurch. Destroying Manston meant Fighter Command had to fly an extra 15 minutes to reach combat. Destroying Biggin Hill would sever the entire command and control network for southeastern England. The afternoon raids hit hard nonetheless. At 3, a massive formation of Weiner's J-88s attacked Detling Airfield with devastating accuracy, destroying 22 aircraft and killing 67 personnel. Göring's staff celebrated the strike as proof of concept. This was how the campaign would unfold, systematically eliminating RAF bases one by one. Then they learned Detling belonged to Coastal Command, not Fighter Command. They just expended considerable effort destroying reconnaissance aircraft that posed no threat to German bombers whatsoever. Meanwhile, actual Fighter Command stations barely registered damage. RAF controllers watching German formations on their plotting tables scrambled squadrons with precise timing. Squadron leader James Nicholson, flying a Hurricane with 249 Squadron, intercepted a formation of Junkers J-88s over Southampton. His aircraft took hits from a Mess's Bf-110, setting his cockpit ablaze. But Nicholson remained in his burning Hurricane long enough to shoot down the German fighter before bailing out with severe burns. He'd later received the only Victoria Cross awarded to Fighter Command during the entire battle, not for his initial bravery, but because his determination exemplified what Göring's 3-day promise was crashing against pilots who simply wouldn't accept defeat. By nightfall on Eagle Day, Luftwaffe crews reported destroying 98 British aircraft. The actual number was 13. German intelligence had mistaken damaged aircraft for destroyed ones, counted the same wrecks multiple times, and accepted wildly inflated pilot claims without verification. Meanwhile, Fighter Command had shot down 46 German aircraft. Real losses confirmed by wreckage scattered across England. The mathematics of Göring's 3-day timeline was already collapsing, but the Reichsmarschall refused to acknowledge it. Tomorrow would bring the breakthrough. Tomorrow Fighter Command would crack. Tomorrow never brought that breakthrough. Instead, it brought Luftwaffe pilots, limping back to French airfields with stories that contradicted everything their intelligence officers had told them. The Spitfire, they'd been assured, was a decent enough aircraft, but nothing the Messerschmitt Bf-1009 couldn't handle. The Hurricane was supposedly obsolete, a lumbering target that would fall easily to superior German fighters. These assessments weren't just wrong, they were catastrophically, fatally wrong, in ways that would cost the Luftwaffe dearly throughout August and September. The reality hit home during the massive raids of the 15th of August. Luftwaffe bomber crews promised minimal fighter opposition, instead encountered wave after wave of British fighters that seemed to materialize from nowhere. Flight Lieutenant James Brindley Nicholson's squadron wasn't an isolated case. Across southern England, Hurricane and Spitfire squadrons were ripping into German formations with a ferocity that shattered pre-battle assumptions. The Hurricanes, far from being obsolete, carried 8 Browning 303 machine guns capable of pouring 560 rounds into a target within 3 seconds. Pilots discovered this wasn't a weapon system. It was a flying chainsaw. Then there was the Spitfire, which Luftwaffe intelligence had dismissed as too few in number to matter. The reality was rather different. By August 1940, Supermarines factories and shadow production facilities were delivering roughly 100 Spitfires monthly. and the aircraft German pilots encountered bore little resemblance to the underpowered design their briefings described. The Mark I Spitfire, powered by a Rolls-Royce Merlin III engine, producing 1,030 horsepower, could reach 362 mph, faster than the Messed Bf 109 Emil at most combat altitudes. Its turning circle was tighter, its rate of roll superior, and in the hands of a competent pilot, it could outmaneuver anything the Luftwaffe possessed. German fighter pilots began filing reports that their commanders initially refused to believe. Oberleutnant Julius Naumann, flying with Jacques 27, wrote in his diary after combat on the 16th of August that British fighters were appearing in far greater numbers than intelligence promised, and that the Spitfire is faster than we were told and climbs like a homesick angel. These weren't isolated observations. Across Luftwaffe fighter units, pilots reported the same disturbing pattern. Fighter Command wasn't collapsing, wasn't running out of aircraft, and certainly wasn't flying obsolete equipment. The Hurricane, in particular, demolished German assumptions. This aircraft was supposed to be Fighter Command's weak link, a stopgap fighter kept in service only because Britain couldn't produce enough Spitfires. Instead, German bomber crews learned to dread it. The Hurricane Mark I could reach 328 mph, not as fast as the Spitfire or Bf 1009, but perfectly adequate for attacking bombers. Its stable gun platform made it devastatingly accurate, and its robust construction meant it could absorb battle damage that would down more delicate aircraft. By August 1940, Fighter Command operated more Hurricanes than Spitfires. Roughly 32 Hurricane squadrons versus 19 Spitfire squadrons, which meant the aircraft Luftwaffe intelligence had dismissed as negligible, was actually the primary threat to German bombers. The numbers told a story Göring refused to hear. On the 17th of August, Luftwaffe bombers attacked in force again. They claimed 78 British fighters destroyed. The actual number was 8. Meanwhile, Fighter Command had shot down 71 German aircraft. Real verifiable losses that could be counted in crashed Hankels littering English fields. The 3-day promise was now 4 days old, and Fighter Command was stronger than when the battle began. Göring's response to these failures wasn't to reassess his intelligence or adjust his strategy based on reality. Instead, he did what autocratic commanders throughout history have done when confronted with uncomfortable truths. He blamed his subordinates and started making increasingly erratic tactical decisions that transformed a difficult battle into an unwinnable one. The first major blunder came on the 19th of August, when the Reichsmarschall summoned his fighter commanders to Kararinhol, his palatial hunting lodge, for what became known as the Conference of Recrimination. Göring arrived furious that his 3-day promise had stretched to nearly a week without Fighter Command showing any sign of collapse. Rather than acknowledging his faulty intelligence, he accused his fighter pilots of cowardice. The Mess's Bf of 109 pilots, he thundered, were failing to protect the bombers properly. From now on, fighters would fly in close formation with the bombers they escorted, so close that they'd be essentially shackled to the slower aircraft. Fighter commanders tried explaining this was tactical madness. The Bf 109's advantage was speed and altitude. Forcing it to throttle back and stay level with lumber-laden Hankels threw away every strength German fighters possessed. Göring wouldn't hear it. Oberleutnant and Adolf Galland, one of Germany's finest fighter commanders, later wrote that this single decision reduced the fighter force to the level of the bombers. The impact was immediate and devastating. Messmid pilots, previously able to climb above RAF formations and dive onto them with speed advantage, now had to waddle across the channel at bomber speed and altitude, perfect targets for Spitfires that could approach from above with all the energy advantage. Luftwaffe bomber losses actually increased because fighters tied to close escort couldn't maneuver freely to engage British attackers. On the 24th of August, RAF fighters savaged a heavily escorted bomber formation attacking Portsmouth, shooting down 12 aircraft despite the protective screen of Mess flying uselessly alongside. Then came Göring's second catastrophic decision, born partly from frustration and partly from accident. On the night of the 24th of August, a lost Luftwaffe bomber crew accidentally dropped their payload on central London, killing civilians in Bethnal Green and Stephanie. Churchill ordered immediate retaliation. RAF bombers hit Berlin the following night. The damage was negligible, but the psychological impact on Hitler was enormous. The Führer had personally promised the German people that enemy bombs would never fall on the capital. Now RAF bombers had made him a liar. Hitler's rage gave Göring an opportunity to escape his failing strategy. On the 7th of September, after 2 weeks of grinding attrition against RAF airfields that was slowly working despite the cost, Göring shifted the Luftwaffe's entire focus to London. It was presented as retaliation for the Berlin raid. But the real motivation was simpler. Attacking cities produced dramatic results that looked good in newsreels, whilst the grinding work of destroying sector stations yielded only incremental progress that was difficult to measure or report to Hitler. The decision saved Fighter Command. RAF sector stations like Biggin Hill, Kenley and Tangmere had taken serious damage throughout late August. Another week of concentrated attacks might have actually disrupted Dowding's control system enough to matter. Instead, Göring pulled his bombers away from the targets that mattered and sent them against a city that, however symbolically important, had no tactical value whatsoever. Dowding's controllers watched German formations heading for London on their plotting tables and scrambled squadrons with perfect coordination, knowing exactly where the raiders would be. Behind the drama of aerial combat and strategic blunders lay a simpler, more brutal reality: mathematics. Göring's 3-day promise had always been arithmetically impossible, but the numbers became undeniable as August bled into September. Fighter Command wasn't just surviving, it was growing stronger whilst the Luftwaffe bled itself white against an enemy that could replace losses faster than Germany could inflict them. The production numbers told a story that Luftwaffe intelligence either couldn't see or refused to acknowledge. In July 1940, British factories delivered 496 fighters, 329 Hurricanes, and 167 Spitfires. German intelligence estimated Britain could produce perhaps 180 fighters monthly at most. They were off by nearly 300 aircraft. August brought 523 new British fighters. September delivered 467. These weren't theoretical production targets or propaganda figures. These were actual aircraft rolling off assembly lines, being flown to operational squadrons and entering combat. Lord Beaverbrook, Churchill's Minister of Aircraft Production, had performed something close to an industrial miracle. He'd ruthlessly cannibalized training aircraft for parts, established shadow factories across Britain to disperse production, and implemented repair facilities that could return damaged aircraft to service within days rather than weeks. Crashed fighters that German pilots counted as kills often returned to combat within 72 hours, patched, repainted, and handed to replacement pilots. Beaverbrook even established civilian repair organization units that could rebuild aircraft with up to 60% structural damage, machines that by any reasonable measure should have been written off as total losses. The Luftwaffe had no equivalent system. German aircraft production in July 1940 delivered 164 Messerschmitt Bf-19s, the fighter that was supposed to establish air superiority. August brought 173. Britain was outbuilding Germany in fighters by a ratio exceeding 3.1, and the gap was widening. Every week the battle continued. Fighter Command's numerical advantage grew whilst the Luftwaffe's shrank, but production numbers only mattered if you had pilots to fly the aircraft. And here Dowding revealed the genius of his rotation system. Rather than fight his squadrons to exhaustion, he operated on a 3-tier structure. Frontline squadrons in 11 group defending southeastern England fought intensively for 2 weeks, then rotated north to quieter sectors for rest and retraining. Fresh squadrons moved south to replace them. Exhausted squadrons went further north to Scotland or Northern Ireland, where they absorbed replacement pilots and rebuilt combat strength before eventually rotating back to the front line. This meant Luftwaffe bomber crews faced fresh, well-rested pilots on nearly every mission. German fighter units had no such luxury. They flew from the same French airfields day after day, accumulating exhaustion, watching squadron mates fail to return, and seeing no end to the grinding attrition. By early September, Jägerschwader 26 had lost 40% of its pilots killed or seriously wounded. Jägerschwader 3 had suffered similarly. These losses couldn't be replaced. Germany's pilot training infrastructure couldn't produce skilled fighter pilots at the rate Britain's system was destroying them. The mathematics became inescapable. Between the 13th of August and the 6th of September, Fighter Command lost 276 aircraft in combat. During the same period, British factories delivered 1,476 new fighters. The Luftwaffe destroyed fewer aircraft in a month than Britain produced in 6 days. Meanwhile, German bomber losses exceeded 400 aircraft. Machines that took longer to build, required larger crews, and represented far greater industrial investment than fighters. The 15th of September 1940 began with fog over the Channel, fitting weather for what would become the most decisive day in the entire battle. By mid-morning, the skies cleared, and Luftwaffe commanders assembled the largest formations they'd yet thrown at London. Göring, increasingly desperate to show Hitler some tangible result from his month-long campaign, ordered 2 massive waves that would finally break Fighter Command's resistance. The first formation, numbering over 200 aircraft, crossed the Kent coast at 11. The second, even larger, would follow 3 hours later. What the Germans didn't know was that Churchill himself was visiting 11 Group's operations room at Oxbridge that morning, standing on the gallery above the plotting table where WAF plotters tracked every incoming raid. The Prime Minister watched as controller indicators around the room's periphery lit up, each bulb representing a squadron scrambling to intercept. Park's voice crackled through speakers, coordinating the response with calm precision. More squadrons scrambled, more lights illuminated. Churchill turned to Air Vice Marshal Keith Park and asked a question that betrayed his concern. "What other reserves have we?" Park's reply was stark. "There are none." Every serviceable fighter in southeastern England was airborne. It was exactly the kind of maximum effort the Luftwaffe had been trying to force for weeks. Getting Fighter Command to commit everything to a single massive engagement where German numerical superiority would prove decisive, except the numerical superiority no longer existed. Fighter Command threw 276 fighters at that first formation, and what should have been Germany's overwhelming advantage evaporated in a sprawling air battle that stretched from the Kent coast to the London suburbs. Squadron leader Douglas Bader, leading the Duxford wing of 5 squadrons, 60 fighters operating as a single masked formation, tore into the bomber stream over North London. Spitfires from 609 Squadron dove through the Messerschmitt escort, forcing German fighters to break formation and engage, whilst Hurricanes from 242 Squadron hammered the exposed bombers. The coordinated attack shattered German cohesion. Bomber crews, seeing British fighters appearing in unprecedented numbers, jettisoned their loads wherever they fell and turned for home. Some bombs hit London. Buckingham Palace took damage, but the concentrated attack Göring had planned dissolved into chaos. The second wave arrived at 2, even larger than the first. Luftwaffe commanders assured bomber crews that Fighter Command must have exhausted itself during the morning battle. Instead, British fighters rose to meet them in numbers that seemed impossible. Park had executed another precisely timed rotation. Damaged aircraft had landed, refueled, and rearmed whilst fresh squadrons scrambled from satellite airfields. To German crews, it appeared the RAF had limitless reserves. Flight Lieutenant Brian Lane, leading 92 Squadron, intercepted a formation of Dornier 17s over Canterbury. His combat report describes the bombers' panic. The enemy formations split up completely. Several D-17s were seen to go down in flames, and others broke away and jettisoned their bombs indiscriminately. This wasn't the disciplined aerial assault Göring had promised. This was a routed force fleeing for the Channel. By nightfall, Fighter Command had flown 597 sorties, a record that demonstrated just how thoroughly Dowding's rotation system maintained operational tempo. The RAF claimed 85 German aircraft destroyed. The actual number was closer to 60, but even that represented catastrophic losses the Luftwaffe couldn't sustain. More importantly, the Luftwaffe had failed to overwhelm Fighter Command on the one day when they'd committed everything to achieving it. 2 days later, Hitler postponed Operation Sealion indefinitely. The barges assembled in channels began dispersing. Göring's 3-day promise had stretched to 35 days, and Fighter Command was still there. The battle officially continued until the 31st of October 1940, when the Air Ministry declared the daylight campaign over and Luftwaffe operations shifted to night bombing. 4 months had passed since Göring made his 3-day promise. When historians finally tallied the actual losses, the numbers revealed just how catastrophically wrong the Reichsmarschall had been. The Luftwaffe lost 1,907 aircraft, destroyed or damaged, beyond repair between the 10th of July and the 31st of October. Fighter Command lost 1,074 aircraft. Still a grievous toll, but sustainable because British factories replaced them faster than German bombers could destroy them. Those 1,977 German aircraft represented more than just metal and fuel. Breaking down the losses by type revealed the true cost. The Luftwaffe lost 535 Messerschmitt Bf-1000s, the fighter that was supposed to sweep British opposition from the skies. Gone with them were pilots who'd cut their teeth in Spain and Poland, irreplaceable veterans whose training had taken years, and whose experience couldn't be replicated in hurried training programs. Germany lost 279 Mess's Bf-110s, the twin-engine heavy fighter that proved too slow and unmaneuverable to survive against Spitfires. Every one of these aircraft represented thousands of man-H hours in factories that were already struggling to maintain production rates. The bomber losses cut even deeper. 569 Heinkel 111s, the backbone of the Luftwaffe's medium bomber force, failed to return from missions over Britain. 321 Dornier D-17s followed them down. 223 Weiners U-88s, the vaunted Stuka dive bomber that had terrorized Poland and France, proved catastrophically vulnerable to 8 gunfighters and were withdrawn from the battle entirely after losses approached 50% in some units. Each bomber carried crews of 4 to 5 men, and crew losses exceeded aircraft losses because many damaged aircraft crashed with survivors, whilst others came down in the channel where rescue was impossible. By late October, entire Luftwaffe units existed only on paper. Camp Gashrader II, which had opened the battle in July with 90 operational Dornier D-17s, fielded 23 serviceable aircraft by month's end. Jägerschrader 52 lost every one of its original pilots who'd begun the campaign. Killed, wounded, or missing. These weren't units that could be rebuilt with a few weeks' rest and some replacement aircraft. The institutional knowledge, the combat experience, the crew cohesion that made these formations effective had been burned away in 4 months of grinding attrition that was never supposed to last beyond 3 days. The economic cost was staggering. Each Heinkel He-111 required approximately 30,000 man-hour to build. 569 of them destroyed meant over 17 million man-H hours of skilled labour converted into wreckage scattered across England. A Messid Bf-109 took 4,000 man-hour to produce. 535 lost meant over 2 million man-hour wasted. Germany's aircraft industry was churning out replacements, but every aircraft sent to replace losses in Britain was one that couldn't be sent to the Eastern Front, where Hitler was already planning his next campaign. Meanwhile, Fighter Command ended October with more operational fighters than it had possessed in July. Dowding's rotation system meant pilot fatigue, whilst severe remained manageable. British aircraft production was hitting new records monthly. The strategic mathematics hadn't just failed to support Göring's 3-day promise. They'd revealed it as the most expensive miscalculation in military aviation history. Germany had gambled enormous resources on a quick victory and instead bled itself white, achieving nothing. The immediate consequence of Fighter Command's victory was preventing Operation Sealion and keeping Britain in the war. But the strategic implications rippled far beyond 1940. What Dowding and his pilots had proved that an integrated air defense system could defeat a numerically superior attacking force fundamentally rewrote how nations thought about aerial warfare. Before the Battle of Britain, conventional wisdom held that the bomber would always get through, a phrase popularized by former Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin in 1932. Göring's failure demolished that assumption permanently. The integrated defense model became the template for every major air defense system built during the remainder of the 20th century. The United States studied Dowding's system intensely and implemented its principles in the Semi-Automatic Ground Environment or SAGE network during the Cold War, a continental defense system that used radar stations, computer processing, and fighter direction centers to protect North America from Soviet bomber attack. The Soviet Union built its own version, the Soviet Air Defense Forces, which operated as a separate military branch entirely dedicated to replicating what Fighter Command had achieved. Both systems traced their conceptual lineage directly back to those plotting tables at Bentley Priory, where WAFs moved markers across maps, whilst controllers vetoed Spitfires onto incoming raids. Modern air defense relies on the same fundamental principles Dowding established. Early warning, centralized control, distributed execution, and the ability to concentrate force at decisive points remain the bedrock of defensive aerial strategy. When Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990, coalition forces established an integrated air defense system over Saudi Arabia that used AWACS aircraft, ground radar, Patriot missile batteries, and fighter patrols coordinated through command centers, a technologically advanced version of what Fighter Command had pioneered 50 years earlier. The principles hadn't changed, only the tools implementing them. The battle also established doctrinal lessons about fighter employment that remained relevant through jet age and into the era of stealth aircraft. The Luftwaffe's mistake of shackling fighters to close bomber escort became a cautionary tale taught at every Air Force academy. During the Vietnam War, American F-4 Phantom crews initially operated under restrictive rules of engagement that limited their effectiveness, echoing Göring's tactical interference. When restrictions eased and fighters gained freedom to engage on their own terms, kill ratios improved dramatically, a direct validation of the lesson Jägerschwader commanders had tried explaining to Göring in August 1940. Perhaps most significantly, Fighter Command's victory proved that defensive operations could be decisive. Military theory had long held that only offensive action won wars, that defense was inherently passive and could only delay inevitable defeat. Dowding demonstrated otherwise. By winning defensively, Fighter Command changed Britain's strategic position from desperate survival to viable belligerent. This shifted the entire trajectory of the war. With Britain unconquered, Hitler faced a hostile island on his western flank whilst planning Operation Barbarossa in the east. RAF Bomber Command continued operating from British bases, eventually joined by the United States 8th Air Force, turning Britain into the unsinkable aircraft carrier from which the strategic bombing campaign would be launched. The cost of Göring's three-day promise extended beyond 1,977 destroyed aircraft or the postponement of Operation Sealion. It cost Germany the aura of invincibility that had paralyzed its opponents since 1939. It demonstrated that the Wehrmacht could be stopped, that German planning could fail, that Nazi promises were not inevitable reality. Fighter Command's handful of squadrons operating within a system most of the world didn't understand had held the line long enough for mathematics to replace myth. Göring's 72 hours became 114 days, and in that transformation the entire course of the war shifted irrevocably.